Welcome to Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. What's up, Patricia?
Everything's up, Greg.
Except for some poll numbers.
Except some people in the poll we're about to talk about.
Which is, that is our topic of conversation today. The first major AJC poll of the Republican race for governor this year shows what many Georgia Republicans already suspected. This is a brawl between Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and billionaire healthcare executive Rick Jackson, and it is far from settled despite a record $100 million plus just being spent on TV alone. I think when the full tally is in, it's going to be far more than $100 million that has been spent on this Republican primary. Jackson is at 27%. Jones is at 25%. That's basically a tie because it's within the margin of error of 3.1 percentage points. Brad Raffensperger is at 14%. Chris Carr is badly trailing at 3%, and roughly 30% of likely Republican primary voters are still undecided. So today we're digging into what this poll tells us about Trump's influence, Jackson's I don't know if surge is the right word, but Jackson's standing, Jones's vulnerabilities, and whether anyone still has a path to break through. Patricia, let's start by this. This poll is conducted by University of Georgia's poli-sci program on behalf of the AJC. Of course, we commissioned that poll. We paid them for it. But it is not a predictor of what things could look like when this primary is over. It is more of a snapshot of where the electorate is right now. And I can tell you, based on this poll compared with the last poll the AJC did way back in late 2025, the numbers for Burt Jones, the numbers for Brad Raffensperger, and the numbers for Chris Carr haven't really changed all that much. Burt Jones was at 22% way back then. He's now at 25%. Brad Raffensperger's basically stayed the same, and Chris Carr's gone down a couple points. But the big change, of course, is Rick Jackson got in the race between now and then, and he's shaking things up.
Yeah, we could see in our previous polling that Republicans were still looking, still thinking, still possibly wanting an alternative. They definitely got an alternative with Rick Jackson. Here he comes. He's here. He's got a lot of money, and he's gotten a huge amount of support. Walked in the door. Now he's tied, slightly leading, but, within the margin of error. To me, the big winner here is Undecided, leading in the polls. And I think that says that a couple of things, a few of these need to continue to get their name out there and get their sort of policies and platforms out there. Of course, Chris Carr and Brad Raffensperger are known. I wouldn't say they're famous, and they are known for their current jobs, not what they would do as governor. So Chris Carr in particular still has a lot of work to do. But to me, the big news here is that this is basically a two-man race. Mm-hmm. This is a Jackson-Jones feud. It is a brawl. We've talked about how incredibly personal it is. And the more these numbers stay tight like this, the sharper the attacks are going to get against each other. The more money is going to be spent. And I've said this a couple times, Rick Jackson and Burt Jones have everything on the line. And I will say, though, it looks like this race has stabilized a little bit to show that, again, it's a two-man race.
Yeah. I mean, you could look at Rick Jackson's numbers in two different ways. One is that this guy who hardly anyone outside of political and healthcare worlds had even heard of, gets in the race in February, and, with the help of a huge amount of cash, ends up being, if not the front runner, a co-front runner within a few weeks, right? On the other hand, you can look at it as saying a guy who spent $65 million on ads, TV ads alone, and far more than that if you add all the money he's spending on mailers and staff and all the other things that a campaign has, is still deadlocked with Burt Jones, right? So you can look at that both ways.
Yep.
You can also look at it from Burt Jones's numbers both ways, that he has stopped the bleeding in his campaign. He's brought Rick Jackson down. There's lots of benefits there. You can also say, look, he's the guy who's been the basically running for governor the last 5 or 6 years, who's spent $30 million on his own campaign, and his numbers have hardly budged since the last AJC poll.
That's exactly right. Also, I think that I don't mean to imply that this race is over. It's only between Jackson and Jones, because there's that huge chunk of undecided voters that could accrue to Brad Raffensperger. And Jackson's numbers in particular could drop a little bit because he is making a first impression on so many people right now. This poll was in the field before the most recent governor's debate. It does feel like the Jones campaign is finally getting their arms around what's happening to them, and they're starting to launch attacks. They're starting to place oppo out there. So it does feel like Jackson could go down a little bit. And, if the stars align here for Raffensperger, he could use that undecided vote to his benefit. He hasn't exactly been the most dynamic candidate out there. So I don't know if I fully expect that to happen, but there's a very large share of Republican voters who still don't know how they feel. The other big piece of this, I think, is I am surprised that Trump endorsement has not made more of a difference in this GOP primary for Burt Jones. To be at just about 25%, that 3/4 of Republicans are not doing what Donald Trump is telling them to do. Georgia voters have always been much more independent in that over the last several cycles. They don't do just what Trump says. But I did think that Jones would be surfing off of that. I mean, he's gotten as much mileage out of that as he can. I think he's even spent a lot of money reminding people and telling people, maybe for the first time, I'm the Trump endorsed candidate. He'll continue to do that. But these numbers show he needs to do a lot more than just be the Trump candidate to even think about winning this thing.
Yeah, and certainly Georgia Republican primary voters did not do what Trump wanted them to do back in 2022 when Brian Kemp won by 50-something points over the Trump-backed David Perdue. But you're right, especially now that Trump is president again, he's back in power. And I'm sure the numbers haven't come out quite yet, but I'm sure they will show that Trump remains unbelievably popular among Republican primary voters. Because you know why we know that? Because not just other polls, but because every candidate on that debate stage and every candidate on the Republican side running for just about any office is all saying they want to fulfill and fight for Donald Trump's agenda. Even if you're Brad Raffensperger, who of course made his name in Georgia politics really for standing against Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election. Let's talk about Raffensperger because he's at 14% of the vote. He's not leading, but he's not irrelevant in this contest. His challenge, of course, is that his appeal, and you look at the numbers inside the poll, his appeal is to the moderates, to the independents, to the very few liberal Republicans who might vote in this primary. And the challenge there is the swing vote might help him in a general election, but those are not the voters that decide this race. So his only pathway is, of course, relying on those voters and hoping that the Jackson-Jones feud damages both of them so much that he can just eke in there, because in another race, maybe 15% to 20% might be enough to get in. We'll see if that's enough to get in here and how many of these undecided voters he might be able to snap up.
Yeah, and the way that he's introducing himself to Republican audiences outside of the Rotary circuit, which he loves to do, and he's very popular inside the Rotaries. His first ad has been about keeping men out of women's sports, to quote his ad directly. I've spoken with voters who said they feel like that was kind of a disconnect. They kind of didn't know that was that important to him. They didn't know that would be his first message to voters of what he promises to be doing. Of course, when he is speaking at those Rotaries, he talks a lot about the business environment, a lot about what he's done for businesses as Secretary of State, and talks a lot about keeping Georgia elections safe and secure. But for the TV ad to be coming out so strong on the transgender issue surprises me a little bit. They've obviously made a decision that they need to shore themselves up among Republican voters because they are, and conservative voters, because he is quite conservative, religiously very conservative as well. So I think that's where they see their area of growth. One other interesting thing I think in the crosstabs that we see here is that Jackson is edging Jones among conservatives and self-identified Republicans. Jones does better among independents, and he does much better among Black voters who plan to vote in the GOP primary. That's not a huge number of people. I mean, we have to say that's not going to win over, it's not going to win an election by itself, but Jones has this kind of different area of appeal that I was not expecting to see a meaningful result in a poll, but he certainly has an appeal among Black voters and among people who are not conservatives, which surprised me because he strikes me as so very conservative.
Yeah. Jackson did better, we should note, with older and wealthier voters. And, that might be one reason why, because he is an
older, wealthier voter. So they see themselves in Rick Jackson.
Let's talk about Chris Carr, because that was another big takeaway of this poll. What happened to Chris Carr? He is the Attorney General who is really widely seen as a really strong Senate contender this cycle, frankly, but also back in 2022 when Herschel Walker ended up getting in the race and just steamrolling the competition. Carr made the calculated decision not to try to go up against the football hero that Herschel Walker is back in 2022, and he knew he wouldn't have Trump support because Trump had basically endorsed Walker before he even got in the race. But there was some pressure of him to run for Senate this cycle. He made it really clear, really early, nope, because he got in the governor's race in November 2024, shortly after the presidential election. He got in so early. I remember he even stunned, folks really close to Governor Brian Kemp that he got in that early in the race. And the hope for him was to build that ground game early. He knew Burt Jones would get in the race. He knew there could be some other contenders. So he wanted to kind of plant his flag early and start getting endorsements, start building campaign apparatus, start raising money. But then you flash forward and he raised some money, but not enough to compete. He's not independently wealthy in the same way as Rick Jackson. So he can't compete on the air wars. He has some endorsements, but he can't compete with those guys over, the grassroots infrastructure that they've built, in part because of their campaign apparatus, in part because of all the TV ads that we can't escape from. And he was at 7 or 8% in the last AJC poll. He's at 3% now. So he's gone down. His campaign, Patricia, really depends on that sort of mainstream, more establishment favored Republican candidate. He's certainly supporting Donald Trump's agenda, but he's not running as a MAGA, as Trump's favorite governor. And he just got former Governor Nathan Deal's endorsement. That's a big win for him. But how far does that get you in today's Republican Party?
Well, it's so interesting because GOP voters have sort of this full buffet of candidates they can choose from. They can go with somebody who is a lot like Johnny Isakson, and that is Chris Carr. They can go, obviously, they have their extremely conservative candidates. Carr, I think, has offered some really thoughtful answers on the campaign trail about lawfare, not wanting to weaponize the legal system. That does put him at odds with President Trump, and he knows that. But I think that the money piece of this feels like the biggest problem for Carr, other than the fact that he also has not been like what I call a sticky candidate. Like he says something and you'll never forget it. Rick Jackson has already said many things that I will never forget him saying to audiences outside of the debate. There's some other things he said in the debate that we also will never forget. But Carr has just not landed it. And he has never been on a ballot independently when he was not already appointed to his job as he was with Attorney General. And so this was a real test for Chris Carr, I think, between the money and the lack of, in a Trump era, the lack of the personality trait of clobbering people across the face with your message is not working for him. And when you don't have the money to amplify your message, if it's not landing with audiences, I also think that voters interpret a large war chest as a proxy for strength and a growing campaign and a level of support that they want to see, to know this person can go the distance in a general election as well. And I think his lack of fundraising support has been read by voters as, maybe this is not my horse to get me to the finish line. Yeah.
And Patricia, I think I'll end with where you started, which is, to me, the biggest number is the undecideds. Like that's the winner of this race so far, 30% of undecided voters. That means the race is still very volatile. A lot of voters are not yet committed. I kind of did my own poll of the voters we polled and called a couple dozen of them the other day. And, I reached some really fervent supporters of both Jackson, Jones, and Raffensperger. But I also talked to a lot of undecided voters who are still either not tuned in at all, and there's plenty of voters who have not been paying attention to this, but fully intend to vote.
Yeah, believe it or not, they're out there.
Yeah. Or just haven't heard what they want to hear. I talked to one voter who said, I'm hearing too much about Trump. I don't want to hear that much about Trump. I want someone who has independence. And I heard others who say, I just want to hear more about their tax policy or their education policy. And that's all out there. And I think it's up to the campaigns to make sure those voters see them. But certainly you can follow the AJC in our voter guide to see a lot of their stands on affordability, on healthcare from both parties, candidates for all the top races. But it's really interesting that 30% number this deep into a race with this much money spent kind of surprised me.
It surprises me too, because it's not like, particularly with the top two candidates, it's not like people don't know who they are and that they're out there at this point. I don't know if I've talked to anybody who has not seen a Rick Jackson add. Even people who are outside of politics, like, wait, who's that Rick Jackson guy? Like, who's this guy with all the money? So people are aware of the race. And I think they're still sort of gathering some people, which primary are they going to vote in? Are they going to vote in the Democratic primary to have a say on that side? Are they going to vote on the Republican side? And then I think we'll learn so much about who this GOP electorate is with this primary result, because they have this pro-Trump candidate served up on a platter. They've got Rick Jackson, who is very, very conservative and very, very rich. You have these other two more technocrats who probably would be very good governors. But you have to have that message piece, not because it's a personality contest, but as a leader of a state, especially in an executive position, you have to have people care about what you think. You have to be able to move people. And I think that's why that kind of personality piece translates to leadership. Can you do this, especially without the president, being a part of the conversation? And this test is really, I think, showing voters a lot about what their options are.
I'm glad you mentioned the Democratic side of the race, Patricia, because we'll also be talking more in depth about what our poll shows about the Democratic race for governors. But when we come back, we're going to dive into the Republican race for U.S. Senate. This is Politically Georgia from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Welcome back to Politically Georgia. Greg Bluestein here with Patricia Murphy. We just got finished talking about the AJC poll conducted by UGA's pollsters, the Republican race for Georgia governor. Now let's shift over to the other big race on the Republican ticket, and that is the three-man race to take on Jon Ossoff between Congressman Mike Collins, Congressman Buddy Carter, and former football coach Derek Dooley. Patricia, let's go over the top lines because it looks very different from the race for governor where there's like two front runners. In this race, Mike Collins has the edge at 22%. And as of this taping, what's unique about that is he has not spent any significant money on TV ads. So he's not going the traditional media route yet, at least. He's at 22%, head of Buddy Carter at 13%, Derek Dooley at 11%. That means the two of them are kind of locked in this margin of error difference. We can't really say one is leading the other because the margin of error is about 3%. What we can say is that Collins, is looking like he's not the runaway favorite, but he's certainly the front runner. But the most important number may be this: 54% of likely Republican primary voters are undecided. Collins is leading, but this race is still wide open. I know we were a little bit shocked at the 30% of undecided voters on the Republican governor's race, but 54%, more than half the electorate, still hasn't made up their minds.
This is a great time to remind Republican voters that there is a Senate election happening in 2026. It's time to start thinking about this, people. And if you haven't decided yet, at least start to think about it. In this poll, I really had to double check these numbers multiple times and then ask myself, even though I knew the answer, is the leading candidate not included in this poll? Because there is nobody. The leading candidate is at 22% in a three-man race. That's crazy. This has been going on for a long time. Republicans, it's time. Maybe Republicans also don't feel so hot to trot on the Ossoff race at all. Maybe that's why they're not doing a deep dive into how they feel about how to beat him, is because he does seem strong right now. I really cannot put my finger on this result, except for the fact that both Collins and Carter are from outside the metro Atlanta area, and Dooley is from outside of Georgia for most of his life. And of course, he was born here, but he spent most of his career outside of the state of Georgia. He's a brand new commodity to people. And this, to me, I find this result really mind-boggling. And
by the way, we should note, too, that, of course, Dooley's main benefactor, his main ally, has been Governor Brian Kemp. And Kemp has put, to say the least, a lot of his political capital on the line.
And a lot of his time. I mean, he travels the state they're in. They share, I don't know if they share a car when they're driving around together. Are they like in the same car?
I think they're in separate cars.
Yeah, because they both are on the phone a lot.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're going to events for days at a time, 8 events a day. The governor cannot have time for much besides what he's doing. He's going to wildfires, and he's trying to help Derek Dooley catch fire.
Yeah, and he's told,
Thank you.
Like that.
Thank you. That just came to me.
A headline. But no, and he's told both of us that his top political priority, he has a lot of other priorities, but his top policy priorities and such, but his top political priority is, of course, getting Derek Dooley elected. I asked him the other day, what were his thoughts on the governor's race, and he just pivoted right back to the Senate race, right? A lot of good candidates running, but I'm really, really putting all my eggs in the Senate basket because he feels like only an outsider like Derek Dooley, only someone who has never served in political office before, would be viable to beat someone as strong as Jon Ossoff. And we've talked about the dual-edged sword of Jon Ossoff going into this race, being the only Democratic incumbent running for another term in the Senate in a state that Donald Trump won, but also someone who has $31 million in the bank, someone who has won in Georgia before, someone who has been able to reach out across the aisle and win over these independents and moderates who he's going to have to win. He's going to have to win some Trump voters in order to win in 2026. He's going to have to win those split ticket voters we've been talking so much about. And the question is what Republicans can do that. Now, if you look at the polls, if you look at the crosstabs, let's start with Mike Collins at 22%. He's doing better among men. He's doing better among conservatives. He's doing better among more working class Republicans. That's sort of his base. Buddy Carter, he does better with younger voters and older voters.
Interesting.
I don't know how much to read into
the
that.
Connection?
So the coalition is strangely split. And then Dooley's entire appeal is based on voters who are sort of fed up with the status quo. He's running this dual track campaign that's so interesting to me because he is giving voters a contrast. Like he doesn't want to be just lumped in with the other two. He's running against Democrats and Ossoff and the like, but he's also running against Washington.
Yeah, he's also running, to your point, as an outsider. The irony for his candidacy this whole time, with that being his top message, is that truly the only reason he's in this race is because he's childhood friends with the governor of Georgia, and who has been doing mailers, who's been driving around with him. I mean, the governor is the governor, and he is the loudest and biggest fish as a spokesperson for Dooley. So sort of like the outsider endorsed by an extreme insider. But, Kemp doesn't give strong insider vibes. He feels still kind of like an outsider. He still is so similar to the person who was elected to office more than 20 years ago. He doesn't feel like kind of a DC insider. And that's the kind of outsider that Dooley is trying to project here. I do think also, even though Dooley is not exactly lighting the world on fire with 11%, he's right in the hunt for that second place in a runoff. This race is very clearly going to a runoff. So it's really a dual, kind of a mano a mano between him and Buddy Carter. Yet what we've seen is that Buddy Carter's strategy has been to go after Mike Collins, to bring Mike Collins' numbers down, because they're obviously splitting up the people who are interested in having a sitting member of Congress and very conservative one who are both extremely pro-Trump. They seem to be sharing the same bucket of voters, and maybe that's why Buddy Carter is going after Collins instead of Dooley. But his race, according to these numbers, really is against Dooley to get into a runoff.
Yeah, and that is interesting because there's always that calculus in a three-man or multi-candidate race like this one. If you go after one of your opponents, does it actually end up helping another of your opponents more than it helps you? Buddy Carter's strategy was sort of the focusing on himself in the ad and then attacking Mike Collins. So he's trying to blunt that sort of effect we see in some races by saying, hey, I'm the best alternative to Mike Collins. And again, the interesting thing about Mike Collins is, as of this taping, still hasn't gone up in air, doesn't have a huge amount of money. Buddy Carter's put $7 million or so on air.
That's incredible.
And he's loaned himself at least $3 million, but it might be more by the time this campaign is ended. So significant money from Buddy Carter, who's very wealthy, into his own campaign. Not Rick Jackson type money, but a lot of money, for relatively speaking, for this campaign. But they all know they have to go up against the juggernaut that is Jon Ossoff, whoever wins. And they feel like they will have some resources waiting for them. But Jon Ossoff has already, at this stage, banked $31 million. And he did spend money on TV last year, but it's mostly money to get more money. It's mostly fundraising TV, ads geared at fundraising on cable news last year that did get him more money, were successful in that.
Yeah, and I'm kind of going back to the Kemp factor here. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I thought that Dooley would get more mileage out of this endorsement because it's more than just an endorsement. As we said, the governor is spending so much time, effort, and political capital, and made it known some time ago that he wanted his own supporters to support Derek Dooley, and many of them, particularly lawmakers, have gone on to support Mike Collins instead. At the same time, Mike Collins, I feel like, should be higher in this poll. I'm surprised he's not higher. I guess I'll put it that way. I don't tell him what he should be doing. It feels like because his father was a congressman, the Collins name is extremely well known. He has a lot of money. He personally is very wealthy. He's got about $20 million to his name personally that he could be tapping into. And he has a broad, small dollar donor network as well because of his presence on social media. He's also very tied in with the Trump White House. I think all of this probably accrues to Dooley's benefit because it seems to keep the president out of this race right now because it is so unsettled. It does not feel like there's a Trump endorsement imminent because you look at these numbers and nobody is breaking out. There's not a safe bet among these three.
Yeah. And, we were talking about comparing the governor's poll from the AJC poll we did back in 2025, October. And we talked about how the numbers barely moved for the three main candidates who were in the race back then. Well, let's compare the Senate poll that we did back in October 2025 to these findings. In this case, the numbers did move, but pretty much everyone kind of moved down. Mike Collins was 30% then. He is now at 22%, as we mentioned. Buddy Carter, he was at 20% back in October. He's now at 13%. And Derek Dooley was in 12%. He's now at 11%. So his numbers really haven't budged. Back then, 38% didn't know. Now, of course, 54% didn't know.
What did they say or do? What has been so offensive?
And sometimes it's just a quirk of the 1,000 or so voters, that likely Republican voters that UGA pollsters polled. But I will say, I don't think these numbers are going to shock anyone who's been watching this race closely because a lot of the internal numbers have closely tracked with what this UGA poll has come up with.
Something has happened since we were in the field with this poll and they had their GOP debate. And that was an example of Buddy Carter again going after with really sharp attacks. It doesn't actually get much sharper. Attacks on Mike Collins saying, if you are our nominee, you will lose because you are under federal investigation and that's a problem. And Mike Collins spins around and says, if you're a conservative, this is not your buddy. And by the way, you've been a part of a bunch of bogus land deals. I didn't actually know what he was talking about. And then it left Dooley off really minding his own business and sort of being the visible example of what he's telling voters they will get. Like, hey, if you're tired of Congress and their shenanigans, here I am over here. Do you feel like the debate will move these numbers at all?
Not especially, but to me, it just showed you the three different or the two really different tracks. There's the two members of Congress who are both battling each other, and there's Derek Dooley saying there is an alternative. We'll see if voters care. We'll see if voters want that alternative because there's definitely a scenario where it's just Buddy Carter versus Mike Collins in a runoff, and there's definitely a scenario where Derek Dooley gets in and there is more of a distinct separation between them. I will add that Buddy Carter, of course, was talking about that ethics complaint, that House ethics complaint, alleging that Mike Collins and his top aide were misusing taxpayer dollars for the congressional office on personal expenses and on campaign expenses and other things. Mike Collins has said from the get-go, this is a politically biased, motivated complaint, and he called it at that debate a nothing burger several times.
Yeah.
So
we have to point out is a Republican-controlled Congress that has initiated this ethics investigation. Also, he and his chief of staff have not cooperated with investigators, and that's something else I think that's important to know. Certainly doesn't mean that the accusations are true, but it does mean he has not talked to them yet.
Right. That is going to do it for today's edition of Politically Georgia. If you have a question about Georgia politics, you can call the Politically Georgia call-in hotline anytime, day or night. Leave a question and we'll play it back and answer it right here on the show during our Monday mailbag segment. The number is 770-810-5297. Reminder, if you enjoyed what you heard, we'd love if you follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform and share Politically Georgia with a friend. We'll talk to you next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Thanks for listening to the Politically Georgia podcast. Our executive producer is Shane Backler. AJC's head of audio is Sam Stamler. Production support from our partners at Goat Rodeo, including Kara Schillen, Hazel Hoffman, and Max Johnston. For more of our political coverage, visit ajc.com/politicallygeorgia, and we invite you to support local journalism by subscribing to the AJC. Join us again next time on the Politically Georgia podcast from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.